All right, I will get started. Good afternoon. My name is Clark Packard. I'm a resident fellow and trade policy counsel at the R Street Institute. I'll be moderating our panel today entitled Frictions and Opportunities, Exploring Washington and Beijing's Economic Relationship. I'll introduce our panelists, make some brief remarks to sort of set the stage, and then we can start with questions for the panelists. I envision this being sort of an informal, free-flowing conversation, and I'll leave some time at the end for some questions from the audience. First, I'll introduce our panelists. First is Wendy Cutler. She's Vice President and Managing Director of the DC office of the Asia Society. Wendy spent nearly 30 years in the office of the United States Trade Representative, eventually becoming Deputy United States Trade Representative. She was the lead US negotiator on the TPP and the Chorus Agreement. Dan Eikenson is the Director of Policy Research at NDP Analytics, a strategic economic and communications firm. Prior to that, Dan was the director of the Cato Institute's Herbert A. Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies. At the outset, let me state that I think we would all sort of agree that China engages in sort of reprehensive and repressive human rights practices and troubling foreign policy practices. But today's discussion will focus mostly on the economic relationship between the United States and China. In the 1970s, China was one of the poorest countries in the world. It had a population of about 1 billion people, yet it engaged in little international trade and commerce. In 1978, Chinese Premier Deng Xiaoping began to open the economy, moving away from rigid central planning toward liberalizing markets. As Dartmouth economist Doug Irwin notes in his masterful history of US trade policy clashing over commerce, quote, "These policy reforms led to a dramatic acceleration in China's economic growth and sparked a rapid expansion in its foreign trade. China's share of world exports rose from minuscule proportions in 1980 to 5% in 2000, reaching 12% in 2014. In 1980, President Carter opened trade with China by allowing its goods to be given most favored nation status instead of being subject to much higher non-MFN duties. The Trade Act of 1974 gave the president the authority to grant communist countries MFN status on an annual basis, provided Congress did not vote to disapprove. Every year, presidents in both parties continued to grant China MFN status, even after the brutal crackdown at Tiananmen Square. In 1995, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was converted into the World Trade Organization. In that same year, China applied to join the WTO. Washington, Beijing, and countries around the world began negotiating the terms under which China could join the WTO. Through a series of intense negotiations, the United States agreed to grant China permanent MFN status in exchange for China agreeing to abide by WTO rules, a set of WTO plus specific rules specific to China, and cut tariffs from an average of 25% to 9%. In October 2000, President Clinton signed legislation granting China permanent normal trade relations, which paved the way for Beijing's entry into the WTO beginning in 2001. In 2018, the United States Trade Representative issued a report that served as sort of an indictment of China's trade policy practices. In response, the United States and China levied tariffs back and forth. Today, nearly 70% of imports from China are covered by tariffs that average about 20%, up from 3% before the back and forth started. In early 2000, the U.S. and early 2020, the United States and China agreed to a so-called Phase 1 agreement, sort of a temporary detente, essentially promising to stop tariff reprisals back and forth. And both sides made some commitments, including purchase commitments of U.S. products and some minor structural promises from Beijing. With that, I will sort of turn it over to our panelists. And the first question I have is, I guess, for Dan. Why don't you explain sort of the primary problems that the U.S. laid out in the 301 report? I think you've been pretty outspoken that certain folks are not, are maybe a little too indifferent about that.
Great. Thanks, Clark. I appreciate you having me here and for giving me the opportunity to explain what I've meant in some of the op-eds that I've written. I mean, for starters, for many, many years, I've been a proponent of a strong U.S. China relationship. And I favored welcoming China into the trading system and defended Chinese actions, behavior, and including what turned out to be violations and indeed transgressions that it was accused of committing. But I think our failure to sort of hold Beijing to account early on consistently enough, and choosing instead to rationalize China's behavior, that it had engaged in very deep and very broad reforms to get into the WTO, and that we should therefore grant an extended grace period and go easy on implementation shortcomings, sort of reinforced bad habits. And in the course of the past decade and a half or so, as we were distracted or inadequately engaged, Beijing recommitted China to a model of state-directed capitalism, which I think presents a lot of problems for the U.S. economy and the global economy. That system produces enormous externalities that are borne by other countries, including the U.S. Of course, among those externalities has been the rejection, I think, politically and popularly, of free trade and the rise of populism and the presidency of Donald Trump to some extent. So, but to me, the big issue that we're overlooking, and that the 301 attempts to get at, but I think has failed to adequately address, is this battle for technological preeminence. And my concern has been that too many smart people in the trade community, or especially in the trade community, we're too dismissive of the implications. Beijing has been contesting U.S. primacy by funneling hundreds of billions of dollars per year into R&D and into production. It has been underwriting efforts to conduct technology theft, on a grand scale. And it's been extorting technology and other assets from U.S. businesses as the price of participating in the Chinese market. And it's been using technology for repressive and other nefarious purposes, and to aggrandize its power abroad. So I think for several years, Beijing has been sort of unabashed about its objectives and unapologetic about its commitments, about its tactics. But I don't blame them for wanting to get to the top of the technological hill that that confers all sorts of strategic advantages, commercial advantages, cybersecurity, intelligence, military, including, of course, most importantly, a head start in the race to develop the next generation of technology. And I think for the same reasons, Washington should not be faulted for trying to prevent or slow Beijing's progress. So the U.S. has in place now a system of export controls. It's imperfect. It was initiated by Trump. It's been carried over by Biden. I think we should be doing things like that. We should be restricting investments. We should be vigilant. If China wants to pursue these objectives, we should not be abetting them, and we should in fact try to hinder. We're talking about technology that can be used for a variety of different purposes. So I just thought that people were too dismissive of those concerns and thought that export controls are just another form of trade restriction that are very costly and therefore we should avoid them. But just as important as free trade is, as sacred as free trade is, the commitments of governments to protect its citizens from security threats is also very real and very important. And I do think that that risk exists here.
Great. I'll sort of turn this over to Wendy. Dan laid out sort of the case there. But the United States and China signed an agreement 15, 16 months ago, whatever it was. What are your thoughts on sort of the potential successes and failures of that agreement? Are we going to get some sort of response through this that gets to those core concerns that Dan just laid out?
Well, thanks, Clark. And that's a great question. It's hard to believe the phase one agreement's been in effect already now for 16 months. And I will say, and I'd be interested in Dan's views here, I think the Chinese have done a pretty good job in implementing their commitments under this agreement. Now, when I talk about the phase one agreement, I make a distinction between the rules part that include their commitments on intellectual property protection, technology transfer, agriculture, non-tariff measures, currency, versus the purchasing commitments. And with respect to the rules, I think, again, I think they've done a pretty good job. Do they have a perfect track record? No, particularly in the IPR area. USTR has elaborated a number of concerns with respect to Chinese implementation of those provisions, but it also has acknowledged that they've made progress and they've, put into, into effect a lot of the commitments that they agreed to. But so that's one question. But I think the more fundamental question is, was the phase one agreement worth it? Is it a good, meaningful agreement that's going to change behavior and balance our trade relationship and really address the unfair trade practices associated with the non-market economy? And here, it's hard to give phase one, a resounding A. Did it make progress in certain areas? Yes, it did. But was this incremental progress? Yes, it was. Was it successful in really getting to the heart of the practices that were laid out in the Section 301 petition? No, but it made some headway. And I think that is a real challenge in negotiating with China or any country, frankly. And that is that you go in with very high expectations. And here I would almost fault the administration because I think they set the expectations, the public expectations, so high about what they could achieve. There was no way China was going to agree to all of the demands that the US put on the table. Yeah, is it a meaningless agreement? No, it's a step forward. But the question is, and I think kind of where Dan was getting at, and I totally agree with him, maybe the days are over in terms of reaching incremental deals with China, given the gravity, the seriousness of the problems and the trajectory that China is on. The phase one agreement, lots of hopes that this could take these practices on, particularly given all the tariffs that were imposed. And frankly, one could ask, could we have gotten the same agreement without all those tariffs in place? And I'm not sure the answer is no. I would just conclude and say that I'm also critical of the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. And one of the reasons I'm also critical of that agreement is, again, I think it's an agreement with a lot of kind of incremental steps, chipping away at the unfair trade practices, the level playing field concerns with China. But incrementalism, I don't think can carry the day anymore, given the seriousness of the problems we have with China in the economic space.
Dan, I'll turn it over.
Oh, thanks. Nail on the head, Wendy, with respect to just about every point you made. I would just add a few things, and that would be that phase one to me was a success because it provided a stopgap to the escalation of tariffs that we were seeing at the beginning of up through the beginning of 2020, up until that agreement was signed, and that injected some degree of certainty into the relationship for a little while, provided a glimpse of the solutions to some of the problems U.S. companies were having with China. But the fact is that these weren't solutions to the Section 301 petition and findings that led to the tariff war and the need for the ceasefire in the first place. Presumably that's coming in phase two, if that's to ever come about. But for consistency and efficacy, I think we should kill the phase one deal altogether. For consistency, if we're going to take exception to China's state capitalism, the market distorting role played by Beijing and the Chinese economy, we can't simultaneously sanctify or endorse that role by entering into an agreement that commits Beijing to specific purchasing targets. It's kind of silly. Phase one is also discriminatory toward the EU and Japan and Korea and others whose assistance we're going to need if we're going to have a comprehensive solution or mitigation of the China problem. I think phase one provides Beijing with a tool to drive a wedge between the United States and its allies. Why should the EU work with the United States to pressure China to change its practices when the United States is carving out portions of the Chinese market just for U.S. firms? I think Beijing has sought in the past to play the U.S. and China off against each other over the years. Indeed, one of the reasons the Bush 41 administration opted to re-engage with China after Tiananmen was was concerned that if the U.S. turned its back on China, that the Germans and the French and the Brits would have capitalized on the commercial opportunities at U.S. expense. So it's not that Beijing is especially adept at capitalizing on such tools nowadays. As Wendy said, the CAI, which was announced late last year, that likely would have reinforced the wedge between the U.S. and EU, but Beijing seems to have squandered that opportunity by angering Europeans over sanctions of EU officials, which led to suspension of the investment deal. But the fact is that the Chinese market still offers a lot to Western businesses. You've seen the reactions of the NBA and Hollywood when they find themselves offending Beijing. And I think that means that if the US and allies are going to work together to try to convince China to change course, extreme vigilance will be required to make sure the incentives are right and that there is limited scope for Beijing to break up that coalition. So I think we need to think about those kinds of things. And we also need to recognize that the phase one deal is really an affront to the WTO. I mean, it's not a WTO legal instrument as far as I can see. And so I don't see how we can simultaneously aim toward resuscitating the WTO and furthering the terms of phase one into phase two.
So and this is sort of to both of you, but if you're bearish about phase one, it seems to me that the Chinese were never going to agree to most of our demands, like Wendy mentioned. And so the Trump administration focused a lot on, these purchase commitments, these targets of purchasing X quantities of soybeans or whatever it was. And it seems like they were, the Chinese would be all too happy to divert attention away from the more structural issues and willing to just, buy our stuff in sort of a managed trade way. But what should the United States be pursuing with respect to China, or what should we have pursued instead? And would Beijing have ever agreed to any more structural agreements, or were they just sort of buying time with the phase one agreement?
So before I answer that, let me just take issue with Dan about kind of his conclusion about phase one. And that is, the way I understand what you just said, we're better off without it. I mean, my view is we're better off with it in place. It's not a perfect deal, but frankly, the commitments are for the most part one-sided. So this is China that is has agreed to change its rules, change its laws, strengthen its IPR protection regime, and stop tech transfer. And it does have a unique and pretty draconian enforcement mechanism. I understand your concerns about the purchasing commitments, but I would also argue that I don't think they've actually stood in the way of the United States working with our allies and partners vis-a-vis China. Yeah, our partners didn't particularly like the purchasing targets. I think they felt that China would divert their purchases to the United States that would have gone to European or other foreign suppliers. In reality, if you look at China's import numbers, they're importing a lot from the whole world right now. So I'm not sure if this really is an obstacle. And I'm very hopeful. And from everything I've read, I think coming out of the president's trip to Europe, we're going to see a strong alliance between the United States and Europe with respect to trying to tackle these kind of serious structural issues that are pursued by non-market economies like China. So again, I don't want to be the one defending purchasing targets. I'm not a big fan of them. But on the other hand, I think we should keep the agreement in place. And I think we also need to recognize that if we were to say, hey, you know what, we're no longer interested in this deal, what's that message to US exporters who are, who are making inroads into the Chinese market through this agreement, particularly the agricultural sector community that took a big hit from, the tariff war. So that's a long way to kind of answer or respond to Dan's point.
Well taken.
I just want to make just one point on phase one, where I think that, when I look back, it was probably one of the reasons why this agreement ended up where it did. And that is that I don't think there was kind of a unified whole of government position about what they wanted out of the phase one agreement. I think our demands and our priorities shifted as the negotiations proceeded. I think the president was very focused on the purchasing targets, while Ambassador Lighthizer, if it were up to him, I suspect those purchasing targets never would have even made it into the deal. But the fact that we couldn't articulate on a consistent basis to China what we wanted, we kind of ended up with an agreement that's kind of all over the map and, again, makes some progress on some issues. But when you look at it as kind of a total package that we achieved in the face of a huge tariff war that caused considerable harm to U.S. workers and companies and consumers, you have to wonder, was this agreement really worth it? But now that we have it, my view is we should just own it.
Let me sort of follow up on that a little bit. We've erected basically a massive tariff wall between the United States and China. Do you think there's a pathway? Wendy, you wrote a column in Bloomberg about a month ago, probably, sort of laying out the way to get back, start to lower the tariffs. Do you think that that's possible? And if so, what would that look like? Or are the politics of this just so bad that there's no movement in the foreseeable future?
So where I come from is that, when the U.S. business community comes in and they ask the Biden administration to lift all the tariffs, my view is, I'm a practical person. I don't see that happening. I read the politics. I don't see that happening, right? And so what I've tried to do is kind of lay out some options where you could kind of gradually chip away at some of these tariffs, particularly ones that are, particularly onerous to U.S. interest, or ones, for example, that have been erected in sectors like, the medical sector, where we're all better off not having tariffs during COVID. And so I think if there were the political will on both sides, there is a path for starting small. Maybe each side agrees, for example, to reduce the rate of the 25% rate on tariffs down to 20% on a certain number of items. Or we agree to lift tariffs to be negotiated in the medical sector or other public goods sectors. Or we make some, very targeted request to China where they, look to address some of our concerns, and therefore we agree that in order to incentivize them to do that, we'll get rid of some of the tariffs. I would just conclude and say, I absolutely think we need to reinstate an exclusion process so U.S. companies, businesses and workers and other parties can petition to be excluded from tariffs if they can show how these tariffs hurt them. That process has now expired. My understanding is almost all the exclusions now are no longer in place, except for ones in the medical sector that the Biden administration has extended. And I think not only should we reinstate the exclusion process if we're not going to be lifting tariffs anytime soon, but also make that process more transparent, more consistent, and I would argue kind of more responsive to legitimate U.S. concerns. Because again, we're paying the tariffs and some of these are really costing, the U.S.
Dan, thoughts?
Sure. Let me just get back to the efficacy of the phase one. I'm glad that Wendy finds that the EU is not really put off and feels that they're being discriminated against and that it's not impeding working with the US, because that's going to be important going forward. But just to comment just a little bit about phase one and 301, there were, I think, alternatives before the Section 301 case was launched that are probably no longer viable. And there are others that probably still could be pursued. So we could have brought a WTO case with other complainants. We could have stayed in the TPP and worked toward expanding its membership as a way of compelling China to adhere to the new global rules. We could have committed ourselves to shoring up our soft power, but those options were antithetical to the Trump administration. But remember that the argument for going the Section 301 route in the first place was that it provided the swiftest and most surefire way to get to a solution for the IP tech transfer and tech subsidy issues. But those problems have not been solved or even mitigated by phase one. We have created this new institution, and Wendy points to the fact that US exporters are now happy with their access to the Chinese market. And now we have a constituency that's now bought into this arrangement. So that could create problems going down the road. But with respect to the tariffs coming down, look, under Trump and Biden, and tacitly under Obama, because it was under his administration that the ball got rolling for ECRA, the Export Control Reform Act, and FIRMA, Foreign Investment Review Mechanism, which have their origins in the Obama administration because of its growing alarm over Chinese tech predation. The US is using export controls and investment restrictions and blacklisting companies as weapons in this battle for technological preeminence. And I think these are legitimate tools, though very difficult to implement with precision. The pathway to removing tariffs, though, some say the real US China problem is over technology, and therefore the solution is to cordon off that battle from the rest of the relationship. In other words, eliminate the tariffs and other sanctions on non-tech products. And I suppose that's possible, but implausible. How can countries be committed to an adversarial relationship in technology while pretending all is fine everywhere else? We know that trade is mutually beneficial to the parties involved, but when countries have an adversarial relationship in an important area, the question of whether engaging in mutually beneficial activity makes sense, whether it becomes pertinent. So the question becomes, who benefits more from trade? So I'm not sure, practically, I'm also not sure that removing tariffs is consistent with the Biden administration's economic plans or its political strategy to win back blue-collar voters who went for Trump. So Trump commandeered Democratic Party trade policy for 4 years. Biden now has wide berth, I think, to use protectionism to advance his domestic agenda. Trump's tariffs, as recently reconfirmed by Lighthizer, were to induce some degree of decoupling, and that objective, decoupling, seems simpatico with the supply chain report produced yesterday by the Biden administration, as well as the terms of the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act passed by the Senate yesterday. So politically and practically and economically, it seems a pretty high hurdle.
On this, sort of the tools going forward, Ambassador Tai was there before the Senate Finance Committee and the Ways and Means Committee. She talked about the need for new tools to address certain Chinese practices. What do you think she has in mind? Or are we done with tariffs? And what other tools might we utilize? Dan touched a little bit on export control, and we can get to that. But are there other tools that they're thinking about, or what ought they be thinking about for new tools?
Maybe I can start there. I will say that having served at USTR for many, many years, I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in, I participated in, where we were looking for new tools, okay? This was way before we put all these tariffs in place. But I think if one thing the Trump years showed was that, okay, we tried the tariff route. When I was at USTR, folks would make the argument that we shouldn't go down the tariff route for two reasons. One, we'd be violating our WTO commitments, and therefore this would invite counter retaliation from countries. And also that we'd end up shooting ourselves in the foot, because at the end of the day, we pay the tariffs, and it's our companies that have to pay more for their inputs, or consumers have to pay more for their end products. Now, this doesn't mean that the importer passes all of this cost on to the US consumer, either the intermediate or final consumer, or that it doesn't hurt Chinese exporters. It does, they do. But that said, there's always been a debate, were tariffs the best tool? But I think now, if anything, we've all learned that it's kind of easier to put tariffs in place. It's much more difficult to lift them. I think that's what Dan was getting at. You develop constituencies that want to keep them in place. And therefore, we do need to look at different tools. One area that I think we should be really focused on is modernizing and updating U.S. trade laws. And in particular, I think the U.S. countervailing duty law could really stand for a rewrite. And why do I say this? It's because the types of subsidies and financial assistance that China is, and certain other countries, not just China, but are the kinds of assistance that they're giving their firms have become very innovative, very creative. They have upstream and downstream implications. Certain state-owned enterprises not only are the recipients of subsidies, but they're also the beneficiaries, the beneficiaries, but then they also go ahead and they give favors to other companies. And so it's a very, and let's not forget the global overcapacity problem and the fact that it's very hard under our trade laws to take trade action before you can show some type of injury. And frankly, for many instances, by the time you can show injury, the party's over, the game is over, you've lost. And so I think that's one area that we should be paying attention to. This wouldn't need to be unilateral because I think the EU is already trying to strengthen their toolbox, and they're coming up with some interesting ideas on how to countervail subsidies that countries like China are putting in place. So I think that's one area where we could be looking at to modernize our trade laws so that we could respond to novel, sophisticated, and kind of new practices that China and other countries are pursuing.
Great. Dan, you have thoughts or?
Well, I'm skeptical of the U.S. trade remedy laws. I think that they're abused and they're prone to abuse. And I think we've seen the countervailing duty law, the scope to which it can be applied widened. This year we're using it to countervail alleged currency undervaluation in Vietnam and other places. I would like to find a solution that doesn't empower those seeking economic protection. We need tools that convince China to sort of abandon the policies that it pursues. I mean, when China was small and growing, and when it just joined the WTO, it could engage in practices that were market distortionary, but it didn't have that big of an impact because it was small. But now that it's the second largest economy in the world, there are no real easy answers when a country with economic and demographic heft like China commits itself to a course of action that generates these significant negative externalities. I mean, one of the negative externalities has been the changes to the trade remedy laws, to the anti-dumping law, because of steel overcapacity and the U.S. Anti-dumping law has changed so that you can have what are called particular market situations, so that imports from Korea or Malaysia or Thailand or Brazil can be penalized because of China's subsidies. So these are negative externalities that have its source in China's behavior. China needs to feel the costs of these externalities. They need to be redirected so that they feel those costs, so that they recognize that perhaps we need to change. As of right now, they've been pretty defiant that the rules that they have internally, how they organize their economy, is a matter of domestic preference, and it's off limits to the United States or to the WTO. But fact is that the WTO rules do have some governance and have something to say about behavior in your domestic markets. I don't think the WTO is getting much respect anymore from either the United States or China, but China needs to bear the costs of its policies, and the United States needs to enlist other countries to the cause so that they can be convinced that it's not just a U.S.-China battle.
Let me, so we've talked a lot today, and seems like the last 2 years, 3 years has been dominated by talk about tariffs. But the U.S. has also been utilizing export controls, which Dan mentioned, investment monitoring and investment restriction. Let's talk through some of the sort of benefits and downsides, potential downsides, and perhaps ideas to erect sort of guardrails to prevent overburdening American firms so that we don't sort of diminish American competitiveness, and we are actually enhancing national security, and they're not used as sort of protectionist cudgels. And that's sort of open to both of you, but Dan, I guess I can start with you. You've talked about how the United States should be using export controls. Talk about some of the benefits there, but also how to guard against them. Ensure to ensure that the tool is actually doing what it's intended to do.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, export controls need to be applied as surgically as possible. So the debate that we have been having has been impose export controls. People in the trade community point out the costs to U.S., say, semiconductor exporters are going to lose market share. It's going to expedite China's quest for self-sufficiency. By the way, Chinese self-sufficiency in the semiconductors and in other technology is part of the Made in China 2025, one of the objectives. So it's not like imposing export controls is hastening that process, a process that it's not introducing a new process, it's just kind of sort of hastening it. But policies are about trade-offs. There are those costs that are identified to U.S. companies that might lose market share are real, but there are also benefits. The problem is we really don't know how to measure the benefits. Presumably, if we could measure in increments of national security, these export controls are purchasing some degree of security. But for them to work well, export controls need to be multilateralized. A lot of U.S. export controls are now just unilateral, but if they're not multilateralized and other countries produce or have access to some of the restricted exports, presumably China can get them from elsewhere. So it's a porous measure, and therefore it's not worth it. Some things become obsolete and some things become commoditized, and they shouldn't be on export control lists beyond a certain amount of time. So that needs to be revisited and updated frequently. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Rhodium Group had a great report that came out a couple months ago, trying to assign a cost to decoupling, the U.S.-China decoupling of the economies. And one of the things they acknowledged in that report was that there are benefits to these sanctions, these export controls, but they didn't know how to measure them. So they didn't include it in the report, but at least they acknowledge that there are trade-offs. You have a policy, it has benefits and it has costs. The policies we should be pursuing are those which maximize the net benefits. So benefits minus costs. So it's easier said than done. It's hard to measure these things, but we should certainly be thinking that way. And rather than being dismissive of U.S. policies or embracing of U.S. policies because it hits one nail, we need to consider it in its totality. What is the net effect of these policies?
Wendy, thoughts?
Sure. I mean, I think a detailed policy process before, making announcements of export controls or investment restrictions is really in order in this area, because even if you can't measure the cost and benefits, at least you can consider them, because I couldn't agree more with Dan. For every policy decision, there's always a reason not to do it, right? The question is, how do the benefits and costs play off against each other, and where your national objective stands, at the end when a decision is made. And so I'm heartened to see that in the Biden administration, they seem to have restarted detailed policy discussions of things like export controls, supply chains. The supply chain report just came out yesterday, and you could see how much interagency work was put into this versus just the White House just announcing, some new policies. So I think that's positive. Dan, I thought, hit on a very good point. In order for these kind of what I would call these defensive policies, investment restrictions, export controls to be effective, they really need to be conducted in coordination with our partners, because I have heard from companies where they feel that they have been subject to U.S. export control restrictions only to see their competitors in third countries come in and take over that market. And what I always hear, it's easy to lose market share. It's very hard to kind of, bring it back. And so once you lose market share, then it's hard to regain it, even if the policies are changed. And I would also emphasize, I think during the Trump administration, there was a real aversion to working with the business community as export controls were developed. And I think having industry input is really critical. And I've been very heartened to see that, for example, the Commerce Department that was in charge of, the semiconductor part of the supply chain study spent a lot of time with industry to really understand, how the business is conducted, what those supply chains are like, and, have a real discussion on what are potential policy solutions. And so I would just add that to the debate. I would also just underscore, I think to be effective in all of these areas, I think the word surgical and targeted is really key. If you cast the net too wide, you're going to find it very difficult to find allies and partners who are going to become part of your group. And you're also going to make it increasingly difficult for business to give you any kind of input if the questions you're asking them are so broad or you don't even want to hear their response.
So we've talked a little bit today about tariffs and investment restrictions and export controls. Wendy, how cognizant were you when you were at USTR of using the TPP as a sort of a positive sum tool to sort of, I guess, all three of us are veterans of the fight for TPP. Wendy probably more so than Dan and me. But how much did that sort of weigh into your thinking and USTR's thinking as we were pursuing TPP negotiations?
Well, clearly, in my mind, the objective of TPP was to kind of create an alternative set of rules and norms and standards that would set the course for trade and investment in the Asia Pacific region that would be a real and meaningful alternative to the state capitalism model that China was following. And so, you start with that premise. I think it was very important to have, I think you use this word, Clark, like an affirmative agenda. That if we came in and said, all you countries join us, we want to eat China's lunch, I think would have been very hard to proceed with that negotiation. But if you can state things in the positive, in the affirmative, it's easier to bring other countries on board. And I'm heartened to see that the Biden administration is doing that, whether it be with respect to Quad initiatives or the joint statements with President Moon and Prime Minister Suga, and the one that will come out of the EU summit or the G7 summit. I think it'll be less about complaining about China and more about kind of, pursuing an affirmative agenda of advanced technology cooperation, setting standards, developing clean technologies, coordinating R&D, things like that. So again, I think that was important. Now, when it came time to sell it, that was a different question. And that's when the decision, I think, was made at the high levels in the Obama administration that politically, the way to sell the deal was less on, what was in each chapter and more about how, we need to develop the rules, not China. If you let China do this, and the RCEP goes forward, for example, then you're going to have China in the driver's seat, not in the US and its allies and partners. We won't have this, the whole term of race to the bottom became, I think, kind of a rallying cry for TPP.
Dan, thoughts on sort of an affirmative trade agenda as a way to sort of induce changes in China?
I agree with Wendy that would be a godsend if from the G7 and other meetings among the democracies we can produce some affirmative agenda, something to strive toward. That would be a sea change, because as Wendy noted, and I was going to mention this if she hadn't, the TPP sort of fell on deaf ears. I mean, it's unclear whether it would have even passed the Congress before Trump, withdrew the U.S. from it. But Obama, his biggest selling point, I mean, the TPP, the ITC did its economic study, and it would have produced sort of puny economic benefits for the U.S. economy. The selling point was, we're writing the rules before China does, and that achieved great receptivity in the Senate and in the House as well. And to this very day, in the absence of bipartisanship on anything in the United States, we find bipartisanship and deep and broad bipartisanship on issues that put China in the crosshairs. And so, it's important to be able to rally around something, but something as dangerous as vilifying and demonizing another country, we need to find a better way to do this. But for right now, and if you want to think about the U.S. relationship between now and the next, 10 years, in order for things to, improve, we need to have an affirmative agenda that allows us to do things irrespective of what China is doing, that encourage China to behave in line with expectations. But at the same time, we need to tone down the rhetoric so that it doesn't get out of hand. I mean, this sells politically, speaks volumes about where our what we're about.
In hindsight, it seems policymakers in Washington were probably too Panglossian about the power of markets to transform China. But we talk a lot about sort of the negative consequences or the negative aspects of this economic interdependence. But it seems to me that what's not talked about very much around Washington anymore are the benefits of trade. If both of you could talk about sort of the trade and investment, the potential benefits of trade and investment on a bilateral basis between the United States and China today, even understanding the broader frictions. Dan, you start with you.
Well, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but they have grown, astronomically since 1978, 1989, 2001, and to some extent, we got high on the idea of the Washington Consensus, and that countries that liberalize economically tend to also liberalize politically and socially, and political and civil liberties will come. That seems not to have happened in China, and and now China is asserting itself, and it's assertive, and its worldview is very different from ours. So it's caused us, I think, to doubt a lot of the premises, including whether free trade is good or trade is good, or free trade is good, and trade has been extremely beneficial, but we have allowed the narrative to be taken over. Look, the China costs, the papers that came out at the beginning of the Trump administration that pointed out the impact of imports from China on various parts of the U.S. economy, that did have an impact, and maybe we were insufficiently attentive to the social consequences of that, and maybe we were insufficiently attentive to making sure that there was frictionless ways of re-employing people more quickly. But in the grand scheme of things, the amount of dislocation, the benefits far outweighed the costs. The fact is, those costs were concentrated, and not dealing with it appropriately has resulted in this sort of rejection of trade en masse. And we need to speak up and speak out against this narrative that has taken hold, and that's just kind of accepted wisdom in Washington. I know there are plenty of free traders and plenty of people in the business community who are biting their tongues, but we need to start speaking up again and making the very clear case for free trade.
Wendy, you have thoughts?
I think Dan did a good job there. I don't know if I consider myself, I would join that free trader club anymore. I'm having, I must say, over my career, just rethinking a lot of these issues and wondering like what we got right and what we got wrong. And I do think that, there definitely are merits to rethinking our trade policy to see if it really has delivered what we promised. And if it hasn't, how can we improve the rules? And so I'm kind of in that mode now. I like to think of myself as kind of more pragmatic and less ideological here. But even if we were to kind of, successfully address the concerns about trade, but frankly about globalization and technology, safety net issues within the United States, trade agreements, I think, still are very important, and hopefully at some point will receive the support of our citizens. But I think we need to do a better job of looking at what's in these trade agreements, what's still meaningful, what's not meaningful, what needs to be rethought, frankly, what needs to be deleted. Here I give Ambassador Lighthizer, credit for, walking away from the investor state dispute settlement mechanism. For political reasons, I understood why we needed it, because we needed, the Republicans to vote for this agreement. Ambassador Lighthizer was able to get the Republicans not to insist on ISDS. But this was a provision put in trade agreements. It was very divisive. We spent so much time defending it. And frankly, the benefits of it are just unclear to me. And so again, I think it's important to rethink. When I look back at our relationship with China, when China joined the World Trade Organization, I didn't work on the accession in those days, but a number of my colleagues did. And let's be honest, when China joined, it was a very different China, under the economic leadership of Zhu Rongji, where China was opening and liberalizing and reforming and was using the WTO as that external force to even accelerate the reform. And then the hope was that once China became a member of the WTO, these reforms would accelerate further. Well, that happened for a bit, and then things changed. Some of it, frankly, due to personalities. But the other expectation was when China joined the WTO was that wasn't going to be the end of WTO rules. At that point, also, remember, the Doha round was launched, and we had these rounds of market opening and rule improvement through the 50 years or so of the WTO at that point. And so that was the expectation, that the rules wouldn't be static, or the tariff levels wouldn't be static with China, that we could keep coming back and they'd be part of this WTO community, and we would probably further improve the subsidies rules, or we would strengthen the rules on state-owned enterprises, or get China to lower its tariffs more. Well, neither of those expectations, materialized, and we're kind of left with, where we are today. And I would just, conclude with another aspect of trade agreements that I've been thinking more and more about. And I know some of my colleagues, probably you, Clark, and Dan, will be horrified to hear me say this. But, when you think about, trade agreements, we enter into these agreements and they're supposed to live on forever, right? There's generally no, there's no expiration date, right? And you have the ability to withdraw from the agreement. So it's kind of all or nothing. And I just wonder if there's a way to kind of check in on trade agreements every 5 years and, really walk through or be in a better position to argue that we need to modernize the deal. We need to improve it. It hasn't worked in this area or that area. But it does seem to be something that we should think about going forward, particularly when we look at our trade relationship with China in hindsight.
Just one response to that, Wendy. all excellent points. But so you're speaking of like a provision such that exists in the USMCA to revisit, which another accolade to Lighthizer. If your priority is to make sure these things are working, you also need to balance that against the impediment that might present to cross-border investment, right? If the rules,
right, you need certainty, and I get that, and predictability. No, I'm not supporting the sunset provision. Frankly, I don't really. It's very the provision that was agreed at the end in the USMCA here is pretty complicated. But I'm just saying, kind of that concept we should think about. Okay. I mean, just think about, and this was another thing Ambassador Lighthizer talked about. When I first heard it, I was kind of horrified, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made, is that you look at the tariff rates of different countries in the WTO. Now, when they first exceeded, those rates probably made sense. But over time, how do you justify a world where our tariffs are so low and the tariffs of other countries that were very poor when they joined the WTO, but have since become advanced developing countries? Is there a mechanism to try and address that? Now, I would argue that in the old days, you would say, sure, we'd have another big tariff cutting round that would include improvement of rules. But since these rounds aren't happening anymore, I just want to put on the table, I think that the problem he identified there, both with respect that led him to push for a sunset provision, but also to kind of call out the different levels of tariff rates. There's something there, and I don't think we should easily dismiss it. I think it's something that we should all be given further thought to, recognizing, again, I couldn't agree with you more, Dan, the need for predictability and certainty, right? Because if you're a company and you think, okay, right now, why would I make this big investment if 3 years from now this agreement, may not exist, or that, the tariff rates may be raised by, 10 percentage points. So again, I think use the word trade-offs. I couldn't agree more, but I think it's something we should all think about going forward.
Let me finish this. Thanks to both of you, two of my favorite people, smartest people I know in Washington, thinking about this stuff. Let me end with this. And I want to be mindful of everybody's time, but where is this relationship? Where's the U.S. China relationship in 10 years? Not sort of where you want it to be, but where do you think it will be 10, 15, 20 years, sort of project out, if you would? And I can start with Wendy.
Well, and you're just talking about our trade relationship here.
Yeah, it's trade and investment, sort of commercial relationship.
I'm not very optimistic about things improving between the United States and China. I do think we're going to have to find a way to live in this world together. And, again, we're going to have China in 10 years is probably going to be the largest economy in the world. They'll have more leverage with a lot of our trading partners, in that China will become more and more the source of economic integration with them. And so I see a world that, hopefully we can find a way to live together, but I see selective decoupling. I think the days of, big trade agreements where we solve all these problems, or, I've heard at one point people saying, oh, maybe we should just try and do a free trade agreement with China. I mean, I don't think that's where we should be going at all. I don't even think we would know how to write an agreement that we would have any confidence that would really long-term open up and reform the Chinese market. And frankly, 10 years from now, Xi Jinping may still be at the helm of China. And I think that also, raises some issues which would make me a bit pessimistic about a serious improvement in our relationship with China.
Dan.
I would say only, I really don't want to prognosticate here, but the trade and economic relationship will be subordinated to the geopolitics and the global health issues. So, it depends on what happens geopolitically, what happens with Taiwan. It depends on what happens with this nascent pursuit of a new reopening of an inquiry into the origins of COVID and how that is received and what kinds of fallout and come from that. I just see a lot of geopolitical bumps in the road, to put it mildly, between now and then that will dictate the extent to which we can have an affirmative economic relationship going forward.
Great. Leaving us on sort of a dour note, but with that, I want to be mindful of everybody's time. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to thank again Wendy Cutler and Dan Eikenson. If you have any questions, feel free to email any of us. cpackard@rstreet.org. cpackard@rstreet.org. With that, thank you, and again, thanks to the panelists. Have a good one. See y'all.
Thanks.
Thank you.